Fatal Infidelity. Russell was never keen on driving. He found it monotonous and slow. However, he was enjoying this particular journey. He was returning home from a meeting with a theater producer who was eager to produce his play. All he needed was the funding, and Russell knew he had that covered. He could finally quit his mind-numbing job as a drama teacher and live his dream of becoming a well-renowned playwright and theater director. Russell's grin dissipated as he turned onto the driveway and saw the young woman standing outside his front door, an impatient look on her young 20-year-old face. It was Heather. She must have been waiting a while. Russell stared daggers at her as he switched off the engine and climbed out of the vehicle, slamming the door shut. He approached her with menace, hoping his demeanor would incentivize her to scarp her before he did something rash, but she remained firm-footed. "What the hell are you doing here? I told you it's over," he said through gritted teeth. "I need to talk to you," Heather replied. "My wife will be home soon. It's important," she urged him. Her stern look burned a hole in him, and he couldn't remain strong. 5 minutes, he said with a sigh as he opened the front door. They entered the stylishly decorated living room, theater posters on the walls mixed with various antiquities placed on shelves and mantels. A large bookcase stood at one end of the room, filled with old leather-bound tomes. Russell turned to Heather expectantly. "Well?" he asked, trying to hurry her along. "I'm pregnant." Russell's face dropped. He wasn't sure if he'd heard her correctly. He tried to speak, but no words would come. Heather waited for a reply, but could see none was forthcoming. "I'm pregnant with your baby," she reiterated, in case it wasn't clear. Russell shook his head in disbelief. He began pacing up and down the room nervously. "No, that's not possible. You're lying," he told her. Heather frowned at his insulting comment. "I'm not lying. I took a test this morning. In fact, I took 2, just to be sure," she reassured him. Russell was still unable to keep still. He didn't know where to look, whether to stand or sit. He had never been flustered like this before. He had always kept his calm in moments of distress. "You need to get rid of it," he replied finally. "I'm not getting an abortion." Heather shook her head so as to ensure he understood her. Russell furrowed his brow, staring at her in bemusement. "Why not?" he inquired. He felt his palms starting to sweat. "I want to keep it." Russell had to keep himself from laughing. Was this girl serious? "You can't keep it, Heather. You're too young," she said, cutting him off. Russell shook his head. "No, I just think you've got a lot to lose right now, being tied down with a baby." "You mean you've got a lot to lose if someone finds out?" she snapped back. Russell was beginning to lose patience with her. "How do you know it's mine?" he inquired, trying to get out of this any way he could. Heather stared at him in disgust. "Are you implying there could be a wealth of candidates?" she asked, restraining herself from slapping him hard across the cheek. Russell merely lifted his eyebrows as if to reply to her question in the affirmative. "You arsehole! You're the only man I've ever been with, and suggesting otherwise is incredibly insulting." I'm sorry," he said, shaking his head in shame. "I just don't see how you can cope with a child. How are you going to afford it?" Heather hesitated. She stared at him, and he knew exactly what she was thinking. He laughed incredulously. "Me? You want me to pay for it?" "I want 10,000, just to get the essentials." "I'm not giving you 10,000. I don't have that kind of money," he protested. "What about your wife's inheritance? That should cover it," she suggested with a smarmy grin on her face. "That's why you refuse to leave her and end it with me, isn't it?" "I'm not having this conversation again, Heather. You need to leave." Russell grabbed her arm and squeezed it tight. He tried to pull her over to the door, but she planted her foot and looked deep into his eyes. "If you don't give me the money, I'll tell her everything." Her threatening tone surprised him. He didn't think she was the type. Clearly, he underestimated her. "If I give you the money, she'll find out anyway," he replied. "Not if you're careful. I'll give you a day to think it over, and if I don't get the money, I'll make sure she hears all the filthy details." Heather grinned devilishly. She pulled her arm from Russell's grip and stormed over to the front door. She yanked it open and stepped out, slamming it shut behind her. Russell was scared and angry. He wasn't sure what to do. Could he get the money from his wife and pay off Heather without her finding out? It felt too risky. He needed a plan. He approached a drinks table and poured himself a large scotch, downing it in one. He was about to pour another when his attention was caught by tires screeching outside. When Russell stepped outside the front door, he found a car parked next to his on the driveway at an odd angle. Tire burn marks ran from the back of it onto the road. As he neared the scene, he found his wife, Wendy, crouched down by the front fender, looking over the body of Heather. The young girl's bottom half was covered by the car, and blood was pouring from her head. "Oh my God, Wendy, what have you done?" he exclaimed. Wendy stood straight and turned to him with a distressed look upon her face. "It was an accident. She came out of nowhere," Wendy protested as she rubbed a palm across her cheek. "She's dead." "Are you sure?" Russell tried to step forward to take a closer look, but Wendy blocked his path, pushing him back. "Yes, I'm sure. She's not breathing. What are we going to do?" Russell was lost in thought for a moment and didn't fully register Wendy's question. He was still staring at Heather lying dead on the ground. It felt so strange. Only a few moments ago she was alive and well. "I guess we call an ambulance," he finally said. "No, we can't," she replied without hesitation. "They'll contact the police. I can't go to prison." "Nobody's going to prison. It was an accident," he reassured her, with a gentle placing of his hand on her shoulder. "I've been drinking," she replied with a restrained whisper. "They'll arrest me. I'll lose everything." Russell gave this some thought. She was right. If the police came out, they would no doubt breathalyze Wendy, and it would be a clear-cut case of driving under the influence. The prosecution would have no trouble convicting. Help me get rid of her." Wendy's interruption broke Russell from his train of thought. He looked at her in surprise. "You can't be serious. Who is she?" Wendy asked. Russell was caught out by this question and almost slipped up. He had to think quick. "I don't know. She came to the wrong house. She was looking for a friend," he lied, hoping that would be an end to the questioning. "So no one knows she's here?" "I guess not." Russell didn't like where this was going. "Okay, so if no one knows she's here, we could just get rid of her and pretend this never happened." There it was. He was waiting for her to say it, but wasn't sure if she would. He tried to think it through, but she was already talking again. "Nobody's going to come by asking about her. Please, Russell, after everything that's happened, I can't deal with going to prison. What about my inheritance?" Of course, he thought, the inheritance. That would all disappear, along with his dreams of quitting his job and doing what he always wanted. Maybe she had a point. Plus, with Heather's news that she was pregnant, this made his life much easier. If they called an ambulance, it would mean no money, an autopsy revealing the baby, and eventually it would lead back to him. He would be ruined. Wendy was right. If they disposed of the body, all his problems would go away. "Okay," he said, convinced. "Let's get her inside the garage before someone sees. Then we can figure something out." Russell wasted no time grabbing Heather under the arms and dragging her from under the car. "Be careful with her," Wendy insisted. They placed Heather's body in the middle of the garage floor. Russell could only stare down at the corpse, trying to come to terms with what happened. Wendy was rushing around, rummaging through clutter as if searching for something. She stumbled upon an old rolled-up rug tucked in the corner of the room. "We'll wrap her in this," she called out. Russell watched as his wife calmly unrolled the rug next to Heather. He didn't hear her at first when she asked him to help her, but snapped from his daydream when she called out his name. "Russell!" she shouted, though restrained so as not to attract the attention of the neighbors. "I need you to focus. Help me lift her onto it." Russell carefully lifted Heather by her arms. Wendy took both legs. They gently placed her onto the end of the rug. Wendy then rolled her up slowly. It was getting dark as Russell reversed the car up to the open garage door. He popped open the boot and assisted Wendy in loading the rolled rug into the rear of the car. It was strange, he thought. It felt lighter than he had expected. "You'd better drive," Wendy said, as she made her way around to the passenger side of the car. The car was parked in the middle of a dark, gloomy wood, a thin mist sweeping through the headlights. Russell and Wendy were stood in the beam's focus, carrying the rug over to a clear patch. Wendy carefully unrolled it and pushed Heather's body off the end. "Maybe we should bury her?" Russell suggested, unsure of himself. "Why? I thought you said you didn't know her." "I don't," he replied. "So if anybody finds her, they won't link it to us. Let's just go." Wendy made her way back to the car and climbed in, slamming the door shut. Russell took one last glance at Heather's lifeless body, her clothes soaking in the wet mud. He almost jumped from his skin when he heard the car horn behind him. He turned to see Wendy hanging out the passenger window. "Don't forget to bring the rug," she ordered. Russell rolled up the rug and carried it over to the car. The journey home felt long. Russell was desperate to get home and have a drink. He needed to pinch himself every so often to convince himself This was all really happening. He glanced over at Wendy, staring out the window, not looking well. "Are you okay?" he asked. Wendy turned to him. "I'm fine, considering." "Why were you drinking anyway?" he asked, a critical tone in his voice. Wendy furrowed her brow, waiting for him to remember, but he said nothing. "My father has not long died, Russell, or did you forget?" She returned her focus to the passing scenery. "I guess it just hit me hard today. It's not like I'm an alcoholic." Russell was about to reply, but thought better of it. There was a moment of silence between them, until Wendy's voice piped up once more. "We can't ever speak of this again. This never happened. We will take this to our graves. You understand that, right? Otherwise, I could lose everything." "Believe me, Wendy, I understand," he answered, assuredly maintaining his focus on the road. The following morning, Russell poured himself a large mug of dark black coffee and took a swig. The warmth ran down his throat, and he could feel the caffeine rushing to his head. He hadn't slept well during the night. Visions of Heather's corpse had him waking in cold sweats regularly. The same couldn't be said for Wendy, who somehow slept like a baby. The doorbell snapped Russell out of his train of thought. He listened as Wendy answered the door. He was curious who it could be at this time, and ventured into the living room. Wendy was escorting a young woman into the house as he appeared, still sipping at his coffee. The woman was wearing a female suit, and carrying a brown folder in her hand. She had permed brunette hair and thick glasses that sat on an unusually large nose. Wendy turned to Russell nervously. "Russell, this is—" Before Wendy could finish her sentence, the woman stepped toward Russell, extending a hand to shake, and interrupted. "Detective Mays," she said with confidence, taking hold of Russell's hand and shaking it firmly. "What's this about?" he asked, knowing full well why she was there. "I'm investigating the disappearance of Heather Ames. She didn't return home yesterday, and her parents are worried something has happened to her." The detective spoke with that clear police officer tone. Mays flipped open the brown folder and took out a photograph, passing it to Wendy. She took it and stared at the face of the happy young girl grinning back at her, before shoving it toward Russell. As he looked at the picture, a part of him was glad to see Heather in better circumstances, something to replace those memories of her dead body on his driveway. He returned the photo to Mays. "I understand she's a student of yours, Mr. Markham?" Mays asked, inquisitively. Russell glanced over at Wendy to find her staring daggers back at him. "That is correct," he replied, trying desperately to keep his nerve. "We've spoken to some of her friends, and they told us she comes by here often. Is that right?" "I wouldn't say often. Every now and then if she wants clarification on an assignment or to proofread an essay." He grinned, trying to hide the guilt he felt creeping up his spine. "So you have a close relationship with her?" Mays pried. Russell's eyes darted back over to Wendy again, and found her subtly scowling, burning holes in him. He gulped. "No closer than any of my other students?" "Her friends did say she mentioned coming over here yesterday. Have you seen her at all recently?" "No, not for a while." Russell could feel his heartbeat quickening as Mays left a long drawn-out silence in the air following his reply. Finally she broke it. "Well, if you do hear from her, please get in touch." "Of course," Russell nodded with a hint of a smile. Mays thanked them for their time and was about to head for the front door when she suddenly stopped and turned to them. "By the way, did someone have a car accident outside?" she asked. Russell and Wendy glanced at each other before returning their focus to Mays, trying to appear oblivious to her assumption. "Excuse me?" said Russell. "I ask because I noticed a couple of tire marks running up the driveway. Seems like someone must have stopped abruptly." Wendy cut in quickly, much to Russell's relief. "Oh, that was me. Sometimes I approach the house a little too fast. I almost hit the garage door." "I'd be lying if I said I hadn't done that myself." Mays nodded with a smile, before opening the front door and leaving. Wendy rushed over to the door and pushed it shut, and then spun around to glare at Russell. "I thought you said you didn't know that girl." "You were hysterical, Wendy. I didn't want to make it worse," he answered, angry at this second line of inquiry. "You should have said you knew her. We acted under the impression she was a stranger and wouldn't be connected to us." Wendy was fuming. "You're the one who killed her, Wendy. Don't rest this blame on me," he snapped back. "Was there something going on between you two? Is that why you claim not to know her?" "Don't be ridiculous. I'm not going to stand here and listen to this insanity. I'm going to work." Russell grabbed his coat by the door, and after a cursory glance at Wendy, left the house, slamming the door behind him. Russell found it hard to concentrate during his class lecture on the Stanislavski method. Heather dead and the police investigating her disappearance? How did it come to this? He cursed his lack of control. Why did he have to start a relationship with one of his students? Whilst trying to focus on the sea of faces hanging on his every word, he was trying to conjure a plan in the back of his head. Could the police ever figure out what had happened? Or could this all blow over in a matter of days? But then there was still the issue of Wendy's suspicions. If she decided to divorce him, he would never see a penny of her inheritance, and that would mean the end of his play and more years of monotonous lecturing. He needed to assure her there was nothing between Heather and him, but how? At this moment, he looked up at the class, and his eye was immediately drawn toward the back of the room, where Heather stood by the door, smiling at him. He froze in fear. Was that really her? Or was he losing his mind? She seemed so real. She stepped out of the room, pulling the door closed behind her. Russell looked at the students, waiting for him to continue. He ordered them to read a paragraph from their textbooks, promising them he'll return before rushing toward the back of the room and stepping out into the corridor. He looked to the left to find it deathly quiet of any souls, and then looked to the right to find Heather, standing at the far end again, smiling at him. She opened the main door of the building and stepped out. Russell sprinted down the corridor, hoping to catch her, but as he burst through the door, he found himself in an empty courtyard, and no Heather to be found. He must have been losing his mind. It couldn't have been her. She was dead. Russell went home early, citing illness, but he felt much worse when he stepped through the front door. Sitting across from each other, sipping at a cup of coffee, was Wendy and Detective Mays. It seemed they had been mid-conversation, and Russell had just interrupted them. They both turned to him expectantly. "Detective Mays, I'm afraid I still haven't heard from Heather." He wasn't sure whether to smile or not as he spoke. His mind was constantly tackling the challenge of not looking guilty. He was cautious not to lean too far one way or the other. "I'm afraid you won't be hearing from Heather. I'm sorry to say we found her body not long after I last saw you," Mays replied forlornly. Again, Russell contemplated his reaction. Seemed surprised, but don't go overboard. "We have a few questions we'd like to ask you, Mr. Markham," she continued. "I'm not sure how much help I can be." Mays reached into her pocket and took out a notepad and pen as Russell sat down next to Wendy. "Are you comfortable doing this in front of Mrs. Markham?" Mays asked. "Why? What is this about?" Wendy sat up, curious as she spoke. Russell glanced at her, and he knew he had to take the risk. "It's fine," he said, slightly unsure of himself. "We found diaries belonging to Heather. We've been looking through old entries, and some are quite interesting. It seems several weeks ago Heather came by to inquire about extending a deadline. Is that true?" Mays began, reading from her notepad. Russell took a moment to think, and then shrugged his shoulders. "I can't recall, but it's possible." "She claims that while she was here, you made a pass at her." "What?" "When she refused your advances, you became quite violent and subsequently raped her." "That's outrageous!" Russell was shaking his head in disbelief. "In several subsequent entries, she mentioned you stalked her and even threatened to kill her if she told anyone what happened." "Russell?" Wendy barked at Russell, waiting for an explanation. He jumped up from his seat, shaking his head erratically. "That's not true! That never happened!" he protested with fervor. Russell was desperate for his innocence to come through. Why would Heather write all those things? Was she lying in her diary? "Of course, we cannot take this evidence at face value, but one does wonder why she would lie in a private diary," Mays explained. "It's a lie! It's all a lie!" Russell shouted, pacing up and down the room. "In her final entry, she said she was coming here to tell you she was going to the police." Mays glanced up at Russell from her notepad, waiting for his reply. "I don't believe this," was all he could muster. Mays pocketed her notepad and stood up. "We have a witness. They claim they saw you, Mr. Markham, dumping what looked like a body in the very same spot we found Heather." "Oh my God, Russell!" Wendy screamed. Russell felt his body seize up in fear. He could do nothing but stare at Wendy. Should he tell Mays the truth? But then Wendy would go to prison and lose everything. He would still lose. But he couldn't go to prison either. "I have no option but to arrest you, Mr. Markham, on the suspicion of murdering Miss Heather Ames." Mays spoke with authority as she pulled out a set of handcuffs and slapped them on around a bemused Russell. "No, this isn't right. I didn't do anything. I didn't kill her. It was Wendy. She hit her with a car. I loved Heather. We had a relationship. It was consensual. She was carrying my baby. I would never kill her," he cried, as Maze tried to escort him to the front door. Suddenly, Maze released her grip and unlocked the cuffs around his wrists. Russell paused and turned to her, confused. He looked toward Wendy to find her grinning. "What's going on?" he asked. Detective Maze pulled off a wig to reveal long blonde hair. She slid off the thick glasses and ripped away the large prosthetic nose. It was Heather. "Hello, Russell," she said with a devilish grin. "Heather? You're alive!" Russell couldn't believe his eyes as he looked her up and down. "That's right. Alive and well," she replied. "I don't understand." His brows were furrowed deep, his mind trying to comprehend this turn of events. Wendy held up a dictaphone and pressed play. The recording played back Russell's protests and confessions for his love of Heather and their baby. "Thank you for that, Russell. My lawyer should have no trouble filing for divorce with that confession of infidelity," Wendy said as she stopped the tape. How?" he spluttered before Wendy cut in. "I already knew about your affair. Heather came to see me a few days ago. She explained how you'd promised to leave me and run away with her. But then you abruptly ended your affair not long after I told you my father had left me a large inheritance. What a coincidence! We decided you needed to suffer a little. We arranged it all down to the last detail." Wendy regaled him of the story of how the two women orchestrated everything. Wendy screeching the car up the driveway, and Heather lying down in front of it and putting her dead acting skills to the test. Heather then sneaking away in the dark after they left her body there. She then took on the guise of Detective Maze to really turn the screw on Russell. "It was really you at the school?" he asked Heather. "Of course it was me. There's no such thing as ghosts, Russell," she smirked. Wendy stood and slowly approached Russell. "I have to say, Heather was quite the actress. You must be a very good teacher." "I'll say. I wasn't sure he'd be convinced," Heather remarked. Wendy pushed her face into Russell's and scowled. "You won't be getting a penny of my money, Russell. I should have divorced you years ago," she snarled with venom. "Why all this? If you knew me, why didn't you just confront me?" "Because I knew you'd lie and deny it. Claim Heather was delusional. I wanted an open and frank confession, and to have a little fun in the process. I must say, watching you squirm has been a real pleasure." Russell turned to Heather with puppy dog eyes. "The baby?" he inquired. Heather laughed. "There's no baby, Russell. I just told you that so you'd be more inclined to go along with Wendy's plan. And now I think it's time you left. You can send someone to collect your things. I don't ever want to see you again," Wendy said with relish, gesturing toward the front door. "Same goes for me," Heather interjected. Russell looked at them both. He nodded and turned away in defeat, ready to head to the door. However, before he made it there, he felt rage build up inside him. How did he let two women do this to him? What kind of a man was he that he fell for their pathetic ruse? He paused and clenched his fists. Suddenly he turned back around and lunged at Wendy, wrapping his hands around her throat. He pushed her back and she fell onto the sofa. He squeezed tight and she gasped for breath. At first, Heather could only look on in shock, but as she watched Wendy's face turn red, Heather acted without thinking. The young girl grabbed the nearest thing to her, which happened to be a heavy stone ornament on the coffee table. She raised it high in the air and brought it down with force on Russell's head. She almost felt his skull crack upon contact. Russell's hands loosened from Wendy's neck, and she gasped for oxygen. His body collapsed to the floor, and a pool of blood formed around his head. The two women looked down at his motionless body. Wendy reached down, placing a finger on his neck to check his pulse. Her eyes widened with worry. She looked up at Heather. "He's dead," she said through strained voice. Heather stared back at Wendy in shock. She dropped the ornament on the floor, and it hit the ground with a heavy thud.